This is Steve Zeltzer with Pacifica, and I'm with Gerald Posner, who's author of an important book, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America.
Steve, thanks so much. Glad to talk to you today.
So, Gerald, why don't you talk about, first of all, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I thought nobody had done what I call an overall history of the American drug industry. People had looked at its relationship with the FDA. They had looked at its marketing of controlled substances. They had looked at, how they had outsized profits, why they had these, why we didn't have any controls over them, effective controls as the government. But nobody had sort of said, okay, where did it start? How did we get here today? Why are we in the mess that we are in when it comes to the drug industry? And it turns out that when you actually examine it, time and time again, we are making the same mistakes in terms of government leaders dealing with the pharmaceutical business. They keep running rings around us. And here they are in COVID, of all times, in the middle of a pandemic, where they get to pull some of the strings because they've got us all running scared for this new virus, and there's nothing better for them. So they're back in the driver's seat.
And the issue of the influence of the drug industry in the government and among the politicians, a large number of politicians, Democrat and Republican, take money from the drug companies. Does this have something to do with the really domination of big pharma in our what's happening today?
Steve, no doubt about it. You hit one of the most important issues. The drug companies say all the time, by the way, we need these high prices because we need research and development money. That's bull. If you take the top 10 companies for the past decade, they spend more money on promotion and marketing and on share buybacks than they spend on research and development. And they are the largest industry by far in terms of what they spend in lobbying in the United States at the state and federal levels. So what you said a moment ago, I'm asked sometimes, who's to blame for this, Republicans or Democrats? And I say, well, tell me what year you're talking about. Sometimes in the 1960s, it was Republicans because Estes Kefauver, the crusading Tennessee senator who broke up the mafia, was a Democrat, and he was chasing them and trying to limit their patent powers. At other times, it's the Democrats who haven't been strong. In the beginning of COVID, many of your listeners may remember the very first bill that was passed. So we have Trump as president, we have a Democratic Congress, was an $8 billion funding bill passed in a couple of weeks. $3 billion was money shoved to the pharmaceutical companies for research on a COVID vaccine. And in the first draft of the bill, there were two features. One said the government would have real power to come in and fight if the price was too high. And the second was, guess what? No intellectual property rights. You get this taxpayer money, you have to share the research and information. By the time that bill passed in 2 weeks, those two features were out. The money was given no strings attached. So Democrats and Republicans had to agree. And in the end, that's the problem. Corporate Democrats, Republicans who are in the pocket, the pharma has enough friends on both sides of the aisle that the people who suffer are us, the consumers.
And even liability, apparently, they made the bill so that if you get sick from this virus, they're not liable. Is that part of the deal that they made?
Yeah, it is remarkable. And Steve, now that I've spent 5 years on the pharmaceutical industry history, I'm no longer surprised at that because the past is prologue. And in this case, it's 1976 for anybody who may remember it. When Gerald Ford was president, we had a swine flu scare for a while. The Ford administration kicked into swine flu was going to be the same thing as the 1917 and 18 epidemic. Everybody got nervous. They got these four drug companies, Merck, Pfizer, and others, to put together all of these vaccines. And then the government went to them and said, by the way, give us the vaccines. And before the drug companies would turn them over, they wanted from the government an absolute guarantee that they were not responsible for any liability concerns. The Ford administration gave it to them. We administered about 40 million of those doses of swine flu before everyone realized there was no pandemic. And guess what? About 5,000 people developed this rare neurological debilitating brain syndrome called Guillain-Barré. The government had to pay out all those claims. The drug companies walked away scot-free and made all their profits from the vaccines. Same thing happening now on COVID. They're selling the vaccines to us at a profit. They're walking away with taxpayers' money to be able to do the research. That's not surprising because since the 1930s, taxpayers in America have spent more than $900 billion through the NIH on publicly funded research that drug companies have taken and put it into patented drugs and made billions of dollars on. But now they're taking all those profits, and no matter what happens, blood clots, whether there's long-term effects or whatever else, We will end up paying the money because the government's going to subsidize all of those injuries, not the drug companies. It's disgraceful.
And now Pfizer just announced that you're going to have to take a booster shot. Uh, and these clots, although they're small with some of the vaccines, are causing a problem. Uh, what is this going to do to dealing with the pandemic? Because it seems that the drug companies have America at its throat, as well as the world, where they're refusing to allow other countries to patent the rights to produce the drugs.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the first part of what you said, from the big, almost the early part of the pandemic last year when they were first looking at vaccines, for anybody who was listening, I was saying this is not going to be what the drug company calls one in, one out. One in, one out means they give you one shot and for decades you're protected, sort of like the polio vaccine or what they had with measles. They were looking for something that with the coronavirus, even though it was a novel virus, was going to be a little bit more like influenza. So the idea that this was not just going to be a multi-billion-dollar profit for them for one shot, but would be a continuing revenue source in the future was big. And whether you want to call it a booster shot or an annual shot, or when COVID has a bad year at some point and sparks up and they get to stockpile more with the governments, that's clearly going to happen. The part about the intellectual property rights, the patents, is so disturbing because there was an institution in Norway founded in 2015 called the Coalition for Epidemics and Pandemics. I wrote about it in the New York Times in an op-ed last March. And it was developed with all of the help of Western countries, the US, Europe, and with drug companies, saying, let's prepare for the next pandemic. And if one comes, we'll share all our research. We'll get together and we'll keep prices low. Well, guess what? That worked on paper, but the minute the real pandemic came, everybody forgot about that. Drug companies refused to go along with it. And instead of having anybody with the ability to enforce it, political leaders lost their will. They got nervous. They worried about getting the vaccine at all costs, and therefore they let the drug companies determine the terms. And that, I assure you, is not the way to get a good deal when it comes to pharmaceutical industry.
And it seems from what you're saying that this is not going to get better, but actually could get much worse. Uh, and that is really a great danger, not just to the people of the United States, the people of the world.
Yeah, you raise sort of, so what keeps me up at night? There are a lot of things that keep me up at night. One of the things that keeps me up at night regarding this is that the what I call the people's vaccines, and that's a real tongue in cheek in some ways, but the least expensive ones, the ones that were AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca agreed to market its vaccine at what it said was its cost. Nobody can really get in there and determine the cost, but it was $5, $4 a dose versus $20 a dose for Pfizer. So it's really at a low rate. It's much easier to distribute because it doesn't need to be, in these freezers and large containers. It can be transported around the world into developing nations. The same with Johnson and Johnson, going to be priced much lower, under $10, and also much easier to distribute. Those two low price vaccines are the ones hitting the road bumps. All of a sudden, speed bumps along the way, possible blood clots. There's questions about their effectiveness. So, what are we left with? The gold standard now are the most expensive vaccines, not surprisingly. It's Pfizer and Moderna at $20 each, where there's real profit margins, much harder to distribute, much tougher for countries like India, South Asia, across Africa to get. And I've been waiting for, and maybe I'm waiting in vain for this, for some prime minister in India or a president in an African nation to say, guess what? And especially in India, because they have manufacturing facilities in pharma that are fantastic, to say, we're going to reverse engineer the Pfizer vaccine. We're essentially going to take it apart and put it together in a knockoff way, and we're going to strip you of your patent rights. And you know what? We're going to save hundreds of millions of lives. We're going to pass it around at cost, not only in our nation, but in other developing nations. And if you want to take us to the World Court or sue us in court, go ahead and look like the greedy bastards that you are and see how that would play out. But nobody is doing that, and I'm not sure why.
Well, the South African Federation of Trade Unions has challenged this copyright and the acceptance of the government of South Africa to the copyrights. It doesn't seem that there's a real international campaign to demand an end to this copyright protection for these drugs so that the people of the world can be saved from this terrible virus.
I mean, and that's really, it's really rather startling to me because you think about it, the idea of even patent protection for drugs is an unusual one, and I write about this in the book. I mean, in World War II, we have the what I call the template for what could have been done here with COVID. The U.S. government, these Oxford researchers came over in 1939, 1940. The war was underway, and they said, "Hey, we've got this thing that we think in a laboratory we might be able to stop infections, penicillin." And the US government threw its whole weight behind it. It became the second top secret project after the Manhattan Project. And when they brought in 10 pharmaceutical companies and built the plants for them to be able to manufacture it all, the rule was no one owns the rights to penicillin. You all get to produce it, but you all have to sell it as a generic product. Now, what they did afterwards, of course, is they all looked for antibiotics that they could put a patent on: streptomycin, terramycin, different drugs that had that were slightly different. But there was a point at which we realized that the overall need to treat the public good to save lives was so important that you could get involved in this. You had to do a public service if you were a drug company. I'm not sure why we didn't do penicillin version 2.0 when it came to the pandemic.
And does this raise the question of capitalism as a system, which is based on profiteering, based on exploiting and making profits of products instead of the use of these products for people?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to medicine, no doubt about it. I mean, capitalism is at its most difficult sort of question mark when it comes to public health. And we, meaning the United States, are the only country in the world crazy enough, and I do use the word crazy meaning it, to allow drug companies unfettered pricing power. We allow them to set whatever price they want. In every other country, there's some mechanism for negotiating prices, whether it's with a group, a medical committee group, or whether it's with the government, whether it's public health, or like in NHS, the National Health Service in Britain, which is a government health service. So here, even in COVID, for instance, there's a company in California called Gilead. They had a failed drug product called remdesivir, which, by the way, they had $75 million in public money, taxpayer money, to try to develop. They were looking at something to treat, not COVID, but originally they were dealing with Ebola. It didn't work. So it's sitting on the shelf. Now, all of a sudden, COVID comes around, and the bright people at Gilead say, hey, maybe we can, it's a viral drug, we can refashion this, it can do something for COVID. It turns out it got FDA approval very, very fast. It saves, according to Gilead, 5 days in the hospital. So they priced it $2,200 for the treatment around the world, except in the United States, where it's priced at $3,300. Why? Because they can get away with it. And they did. And nobody in the US government, not Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, stood up and said, this is a disgrace. They just said, okay, that's fine. And they went on to the next issue. And I'm not sure why we allow unbridled capitalism, in essence, to take place with drugs, where at least everybody, I think, could agree we can have a system that puts some limits and controls on them.
Well, thanks for joining us on Pacifica.
Steve, great to be with you. I hope to talk to you at a better time when there's less fear and less coronavirus on the planet.
I would hope that comes soon. So thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thanks.